In the final weeks of 1849, as winter began to tighten its icy grip on the city of Westvale, Arkansas, an unnatural fog draped the streets like a funeral shroud. The lamps lining the narrow roads cast dim halos through the mist, flickering as if unsure whether to stay lit or surrender to the thick gray veil. By midnight, the city had gone silent. Horses were stabled, shop shutters latched tight, and only the echo of cold wind moved through the alleys between buildings. It was on such a night, heavy with silence and coated in frost, that something unexplainable arrived at the gates of Hawthorne Asylum. A bundle appeared near the back service entrance of the hospital, left just beyond the rusted bars that separated the institution's grounds from the outer city. No one saw who placed it there. No carriage approached. No footsteps were heard on the gravel path. But when the fog thinned briefly, the bundle could be seen resting against the locked gate, a curious shape, too precise and deliberate to be. Discarded fabric or refuse? The discovery came just after 1 in the morning, when a passing orderly noticed the outline and summoned the night staff. The bundle, when unwrapped, revealed a girl. Young, possibly 10 years old. She was breathing, warm, and uninjured, though a terrible stillness clung to her like shadow. Her limbs were relaxed, her skin unblemished, and her chest rose and fell in steady rhythm. But her eyes, wide and emotionless, did not search the world around her. They simply stared forward, blankly, as if the soul behind them had paused mid-thought and forgotten to return. She wore a single dress, antique in its stitching and faded by time. The garment had no buttons, no laces, no closures of any kind. Every seam was stitched shut with thick black thread, drawn tightly enough that the fabric had puckered around the shoulders and waist. There was something unnatural in the construction. Of it less like clothing and more like containment. Her silence was not the silence of fear. It was too complete, too effortless. She neither whimpered nor reached for comfort, nor did she resist being touched, lifted, or examined. The staff determined she could feel pressure. Her pulse rose slightly when her wrist was tapped, but she gave no outward reaction. Her muteness was not born of trauma, it seemed, but rather an absence of need to speak at all. The girl was placed in room 9 of the East Wing, a space seldom used except during overcrowding or renovations. The room had not seen a patient in several months. Its fireplace had been bricked over following a chimney collapse, and the old wallpaper peeled in long curling strips from the corners of the walls. Yet it was warm enough, and the staff, unsure of what else to do, left the girl there under quiet observation. By morning, something unusual had already occurred. A faint ring of black soot had appeared just outside the door to room 9, gathered in a perfect crescent as though swept from beneath. The threshold. No one could explain it. The fireplaces in that wing had not been active for days, and no deliveries of coal had arrived. Yet there it was, a dusting of soot that appeared where it should not have. Later that day, as part of routine examination, the staff began to cut open the seams of the girl's tightly stitched dress. The fabric resisted, but eventually gave way. Beneath the garment, they found no markings on her skin, no scars or symbols. But stitched carefully into the inner lining of the dress, just above the left breast, were 2 faded words. Dr. Henry Carter. This discovery cast a long shadow over the room. Dr. Carter had worked at Hawthorne Asylum for more than 3 decades. He was a name of permanence in the building's long and troubled history. A man known for strict method, predictable mood, and unshakable structure. The idea that he had any connection to this girl was unthinkable. And yet there was his name. Sewn in thread, no one could trace Dot. As the dress came apart fully, another oddity emerged. The thread used in the seams was not typical fabric thread, but the kind once used in the hospital's ledger books from decades. Prior of fibrous, binding type now long obsolete. It frayed as it was cut, revealing aged material that seemed to crumble at the edges. The girl remained motionless as the fabric was peeled away, neither embarrassed nor disturbed. She showed no signs of modesty, no discomfort, no awareness of the event unfolding around her dot. When offered a writing slate later that evening, the girl took it in her small, pale hands and began to write without hesitation. What she wrote was not the babble of a lost child, nor a name or a plea for help. Instead, she carefully drew a word in perfect cursive Carter, replicating the exact flourishes and penmanship of the doctor whose name was sewn into her garment. The curves of the letters matched his known signature, down to the unusual tilt of the T and the elongated curve on the final R. This act, seemingly innocent, sent a ripple of discomfort through the staff. Within the day, all slates and writing instruments were removed from her room, and mirrors were taken down from the corridor walls near room 9. The girl never attempted to write again, nor did she react when her slate was taken. She simply stared, unblinking, at whoever entered her room, as though memorizing every detail of their face. The days that followed began to shift the atmosphere inside the asylum. Unusual noises were reported coming from the east wing. Scratching, sounds, faint tapping behind walls. Some staff claimed to hear whispers in the night, though no patients in that part of the building were capable of speech. The girl, through it all, remained unchanged. She ate when food was placed before her. She drank when water was brought. But she never looked at the plate, never reached for the glass. Her hands moved only when gently positioned. Her eyes watched. Everything but seemed to see nothing. Nurse Margaret Collins, who had first discovered the girl, began to suffer nightmares. In them, she would find herself locked in room 9, facing a mirror she had never seen before. The reflection, instead of her own, showed the girl standing motionless, staring directly through the glass, lips parted slightly, as if on the verge of a sound that would never come. Margaret began avoiding the east wing altogether. Others followed. Some took sudden leave, claiming illness. One orderly quit without notice, refusing to give a reason. Soon, no one wanted to speak of the girl. But the hospital records could not ignore her presence. She had no name, no origin, no admission documentation. And yet, she occupied a room that, according to certain architectural records, should not have existed at all. Room 9 did not appear on the original floor plans, but there she was, and the soot continued to appear every morning just outside her door. As January deepened, the cold grew heavier in Westvale. The air inside Hawthorne Asylum grew dry and brittle, as if the very walls were leaching moisture from the living. The fog outside persisted, creeping up the outer bricks, seeping into window frames, and curling through unseen cracks in the ceilings and floors. The atmosphere inside had grown tense, not from chaos, but from an oppressive stillness that blanketed the east wing. It was not just silence, but silence charged with meaning, a silence that felt like it was listening. Room 9, though scarcely acknowledged aloud, became the center of that stillness. Despite the girl's unmoving presence, things began to move. Around her, staff who entered the room noticed small but disquieting changes. A blanket that had been folded and placed on the chair would reappear on the floor, rumpled as though sat on. A metal water basin, always set at the corner of the table, would be found turned exactly 1/4 rotation, as if nudged with precision. None of these things could be explained by draft or movement. No windows were open, and the girl, they swore, had not moved an inch. By the end of the second week, it became common practice to avoid direct contact with her. She was still fed and cleaned, but staff moved quietly and quickly, avoiding her gaze. Even when she wasn't looking directly at them, there was the sensation that she was observing them through something invisible and vast, like they were understudy by something older than human thought. It was Nurse Margaret Collins who first noticed the mimicry. During a routine linen check, Margaret accidentally dropped her ink pen onto the girl's writing slate, which had been hidden away in a drawer. Before she could retrieve it, the girl picked it up with mechanical fluidity and began to write. The lines were simple at first marks, loops, short strokes. But then the strokes took shape. It was Margaret's signature, copied perfectly, down to the tiny hesitation in the second A of her surname. The girl had never seen Margaret write, not once. And yet the reproduction was exact. Later that evening, Margaret tested a theory. She wrote a single word on a piece of paper, something nonsensical, chosen at random. Everwell. She folded the paper and placed it in her pocket without showing anyone. The next morning, on the inside of the ward door, scrawled in charcoal. Dust was that same word rendered in Margaret's handwriting. No one had witnessed the girl leave her bed. The soot had returned in its usual crescent beneath the door. The only charcoal in the room belonged to a sealed fireplace that had not been opened in years. From that day forward, the girl's presence shifted from strange to inexplicable. She no longer needed to copy what was seen. She mimicked what was never shown, mimed signatures and handwriting styles from staff she had never interacted with, even replicated the distinct gestures and routines of those who hadn't entered Room 9 in days. Her body still never moved without assistance. She sat upright when placed that way. She lay down when guided to. Yet something intangible had begun to expand around her, an imprint, perhaps, or a kind of echo of consciousness that reached far beyond her physical form. The very air around her became charged with resemblance. Those who worked in her wing found themselves slipping in small, imperceptible ways. A nurse would use the phrase of a doctor she'd never liked. An orderly would sign his initials backwards, unconsciously, just as the girl had drawn them the night before. It wasn't possession. It was reflection. The girl mirrored the asylum back to itself. The most unnerving realization came from Dr. Spencer's assistant, who had taken to keeping a log of the girl's behavior. He noted, after days of careful observation, that the girl never blinked unless someone in the room blinked first. Her movements, when they occurred, were delayed repetitions of whatever happened around her. If someone adjusted their spectacles, she would mimic the same gesture 2 minutes later, without spectacles, without even moving her arms. The echo would ripple through the environment instead. The temperature of a room would drop. A clock would stutter. The pattern of light through the window pane would shift. Even the weather outside seemed to falter. The fog grew denser, clinging more stubbornly to the east side of the building, and birds that normally perched along the asylum's eaves refused to land near Room 9. Cats and dog strays that often roamed the outer walls avoided the rear gate entirely. In one incident, a janitor tasked with cleaning the floor outside Room 9 was found in the stairwell, sitting motionless, his mop bucket overturned beside him. He had not collapsed. His vitals were steady, but his face bore an expression of such profound internal horror that it took hours to coax him into speech again. When asked what he had seen, he could only mutter one phrase: she already knew. Not long after, he resigned without collecting his final pay. The staff began leaving items outside her door rather than entering. Food trays, fresh linens, even medical supplies. The girl, of course, never came to retrieve them. But somehow, the trays were always emptied, the bedsheets changed, and nothing was ever seen or heard in the process. The more the staff tried to avoid her, the more it seemed she became part of the hospital itself, moving through silence, absorbing identity, rearranging familiarity. Perhaps the most unsettling discovery came when a visiting physician from Little Rock, called in to provide a second opinion, requested to see the girl's medical chart. There was none. No notes, no evaluation forms, no official patient record. The only entry ever made about her was a single handwritten line in the admissions log from the night of her arrival. It read, "Unidentified girl left at rear gate. Assigned room 9. That line had vanished. In its place was a blank space. Ink faded to near invisibility, as if the paper itself had never absorbed it. Even Margaret Collins, who had made the original note, could not find any trace of her handwriting on the page. Other staff logs began showing signs of similar erasure. Names of those who'd worked closely near room 9 became smudged, incomplete, or entirely missing from weekly reports. It was as though history itself had started to recoil from the girl's presence, attempting to undo what had been witnessed. The hospital administrators dismissed these concerns as clerical errors, the result of overworked staff and a long winter. But no one believed that explanation. Deep down, everyone knew that something had shifted, not only in the hospital, but in the fabric of memory itself. Room 9 remained occupied, yet on paper, it had never housed a single patient. And somewhere deep, in the archives, blueprints of the hospital showed no room 9 at all. The walls of Hawthorne Asylum had long absorbed the scent of lye, mildew, and old secrets. Its corridors were lined with portraits of long-dead physicians and benefactors' faces, whose smiles had faded beneath decades of soot and discolored varnish. Each wing of the asylum carried the weight of its own history: fires, failed renovations, escapes, and a few things no one dared name out loud. But among these scars, room 9 had become an aberration. It was not just an anomaly in function or feeling. It was a tear in the fabric of the building itself. By early February, as snow gathered like ash on the windowsills, whispers about room 9 had begun to extend beyond the east wing. A pattern emerged among those who had worked near it for more than a week. They became forgetful, not in the usual sense of misplacing items or missing schedules, but forgetful in ways that distorted time. They misplaced entire conversations, confused dates, forgot their own handwriting, or discovered notes written in their journals that they didn't remember drafting. The girl's presence didn't merely haunt the asylum. It diluted memory. Nurse Margaret Collins, though firm in her convictions, found herself unable to recall whether she had visited the room twice or 5 times the week before. Her shoes, polished each morning, came home scuffed as if she'd wandered unfamiliar stairwells. And always there was the sensation of being observed, not through peepholes or from behind doors, but through the building itself, as if its bones had awakened and grown eyes. The concern reached Dr. Henry Carter, the man whose name had been stitched into the girl's dress. Though Carter denied ever treating the child or even encountering her, his expression had shifted the day he was summoned to room 9. He had not been the same since. Quiet before, he now carried the weariness of someone who no longer slept. His morning coffee sat untouched. His notes became jumbled, misfiled, as if his thoughts unraveled whenever he tried to recall the specifics of the room. But it was when he requested the original architectural blueprints of Hawthorne that something undeniable surfaced. The hospital's archives, kept in a locked cellar beneath the West Library, contained thousands of yellowed maps, engineering sketches, and handwritten journals from its construction. The asylum had been built in stages initially, a 4-wing facility centered around a chapel, with later additions tacked on like crooked teeth as demand and population grew. Some wings had been demolished and rebuilt. Others had merely been abandoned. As Carter spread the blueprints across a long reading table, he traced the outlines with trembling fingers. East Wing, Administrative Hall, Upper Storage. In each version of the floor plan, from the original 1812 design to the major expansion in 1833, there were 8 rooms in the eastern corridor, numbered 1 through 8, no room 9. The blueprints had no markings, no evidence of tampering. And yet for years that door had existed. That room had held patience. That room now held the girl. The thought created a fracture in Carter's otherwise ordered mind. He knew the room. He had walked past it hundreds of times. It was there. But on paper, in ink and scale and math, it was not, driven by the ache of disbelief. Carter ordered a physical measurement of the east wing. He assigned 3 orderlies and 1 junior architect to document the corridor dimensions from end to end. The exercise was meant to be routine, a reassurance that the blueprints were merely outdated. But when the measurements were brought back, they added up precisely exactly as the original plans described. There were only 8 rooms worth of space in the east wing, but the hallway had 9 doors. Carter did not speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was a near whisper, as though loud words might provoke something that should remain asleep. He ordered the outer walls checked for hidden alcoves or false construction. Workers tapped, knocked, and traced every inch. With care, one wall behind room 9 thicker than expected drew their attention. When a small cavity was opened for inspection, they found it lined with blackened wax, dust, and the remnants of a sealed compartment. Inside was a small warped brass tag, no larger than a coin. The tag was stamped with a single marking, X2. No one could identify what it meant. It wasn't a patient number, nor a construction label. The hospital's record-keeping had been exhaustive. For decades, every wing addition, every pipe, even the replacement of hinges had been catalogued. But there was no reference to any item, room, or protocol labeled X2. The discovery was not announced publicly. Carter forbade it. The tag was placed in a small envelope and locked away in the filing vault. But news traveled regardless. One of the workers refused to return to the east wing. Another claimed to have heard voices whispering behind the sealed cavity wall, whispers, not in English, but in a language he couldn't name. A week later, the man vanished without notice. His quarters were left undisturbed. His tools remained untouched on the workbench. Room 9 continued to exist. The girl, still unnamed, remained as unmoving as ever, yet the effects of her presence stretched further. Shadows moved out of rhythm with the light. Clocks ran backwards for several seconds at a time. A patient in a separate wing was found sketching her face, though he had never seen her and had been blind in both eyes for 2 years. When asked how he had drawn her, the patient simply tore the paper in half and refused to speak for days. Dr. Carter, once the asylum's most respected authority, began to decline rapidly. He stopped attending meetings. His journal entries grew erratic and circular. He began writing the same phrase over and over, line after line, in trembling script. She is not in the room. The room is in her. His final act before withdrawing from public duties was to petition the board to seal room 9 permanently. The request was denied on grounds of procedural integrity. Rooms could not simply be sealed based on superstition. But the board did approve limited access. Only a handful of staff would be permitted to enter the East Wing, and all records concerning the girl were to be transferred to private archives under restricted supervision. Then, without warning, Carter left. No resignation, no letter. He vanished as quietly as the girl had arrived. His name remained on the stitched fabric of the dress. But from that day forward, no one uttered it within the asylum walls. In time, his office was emptied, his journals locked away, his photographs quietly removed from the administrator's gallery. Only the girl remained anchored in the room that didn't exist, surrounded by walls that had never been built, speaking not a single word, but unraveling everything around her by simply being. There, and somewhere beneath those walls, in the sealed cavity behind the plaster, the tag labeled X2 gathered dust. Waiting. By mid-March of 1850, something had shifted inside Hawthorne Asylum. The days still carried their usual schedule of treatment rounds, medication delivery, and supervised recreation. Yet, in the West Wing, especially outside Room 9, staff moved. More cautiously. The presence of the mute girl had begun to warp the asylum's rhythms. Where once there was routine, now there was hesitation. Where once staff felt tired but in control, they now felt watched. Margaret Collins had stopped sleeping. Well, every time she closed her eyes, she dreamed of ink-spilled ink forming words she had not written in her own looping script. In the dream, the letters would form a name, Margaret Ann Collins, and then, in smaller handwriting beneath, "It, you are not you." These dreams began the week after the girl had copied Margaret's signature exactly, despite never seeing her write it. Initially, Margaret assumed it had been a fluke and accidental resemblance. But then the girl did it again, and again. She didn't just imitate the writing, she captured its pressure, its flow, even the slight rightward slant unique to Margaret's hand. The girl had never been taught to write, never held a pen before arriving, and yet she mimicked everyone. She copied Dr. Carter's notes so precisely that, when left side by side with the original, even he couldn't tell which was his. A nurse once joked that the girl could steal your soul if you gave her a pen. No one laughed. It was Dr. Aldous. Whitman, the resident linguist and visiting scholar from Little Rock, who tried to decipher the girl's talents. He brought her ancient texts, dead alphabets, and pages of archaic medical terminology. He wanted to test the theory that she was a savant, perhaps one of the rare cases who, despite mutism, possessed extraordinary cognitive ability. But within minutes, the girl had duplicated entire pages of ancient Coptic script and reconstructed forgotten Latin prayers in mirror image. One afternoon, Whitman left a page from the Voynich manuscript on her bedside. It was a test no one, not even the brightest scholars of the time, had ever decoded the text. When he returned an hour later, the girl had covered the back of the page in what appeared to be symbols, similar but not identical to the original. Some mirrored, others altered, but all formed in perfect, elegant structure. He left the room shaking, muttering that she hadn't copied the page. She had responded to it. Word of the girl's abilities traveled beyond Westvale. Priests from nearby parishes requested to see her. A bishop came, stayed 20 minutes, and refused to speak of what he witnessed. Rumors followed him all the way back to Fort Smith, that he had left pale and sweaty, whispering something about a child with the voice of angels, without a tongue. At the asylum, staff began changing their behavior. Nurses stopped leaving. Pens or slates near Room 9. Orderlies covered mirrors whenever they passed her door, unsettled by the idea that she might appear behind them, silently mimicking their expressions. One even reported seeing her reflection smile, though the real girl had never once moved her mouth. Worse still, some claimed they began to hear their own voices coming from her room. Not the girl's voice, but their own. Phrases they'd said earlier that day, repeated back in perfect tone and rhythm, as if echoing from memory. Margaret once heard her own voice say, "She's watching us again," though she hadn't spoken it aloud until after Dr. Carter, ever the skeptic, refused to indulge these claims. He blamed hysteria, suggestion, and the emotional fatigue common in asylum work. "You hear what you fear," he said, "and you fear what you can't control." But even he began avoiding the West Wing after dusk. One event, however, forced even Carter to reconsider. Nurse Ellen Mayfield had only been working at Hawthorne for 3 months. One morning, while reviewing patient charts, she noticed something odd. Her personal journal, which she kept locked in her desk at home, had been copied line for line errors, and all onto a page lying beneath the girl's bed. There was no explanation. No one else had access to the journal. She resigned that evening. As fear took root among the staff, Hawthorne's routines grew less structured. Slates were removed from all rooms. Pens were locked away. Typewriters were stationed only in the administrative office, under lock and key. Still, the girl continued to write using soot, ash, even blood, always with the same calm, practiced hand. Then came the most unsettling moment of all. During one of Carter's rare visits to Room 9, he found a set of papers resting on the girl's lap. On them were letters not written by staff, but correspondence from his brother, who had died the previous winter in Baltimore. Carter hadn't shared the letters with anyone, yet the girl had transcribed them word for word, even preserving the peculiar way his brother had ended every letter with the phrase, "Until the bell tolls, Henry." Carter went pale. For a brief moment, he seemed to consider the impossible, but his rational mind fought it. Coincidence, he whispered to himself, though his hands trembled as he collected the pages. After that, Carter stopped entering Room 9 entirely. The girl herself remained motionless through it all. Her silence was unwavering, her eyes always fixed not quite at a person, but slightly off, as if seeing something over their shoulder. She didn't eat, yet her body didn't wither. Her skin remained pale but unblemished. Her hair grew but slowly. She was like a figure suspended in time-breathing, blinking, yet somehow outside the normal bounds of life. The records began to dwindle. Incidents went unreported. Staff turnover increased. Room 9 became a place avoided by all but a few. And still she remained silent, observant, writing, always writing. In April of 1850, a slate was found hidden beneath a floorboard near her bed. On it was a single sentence, "You made me." No one knew what it meant. No one knew who "you" was, but it sparked whispered questions that spread like rot through the halls. Had someone created her? Was she born or constructed? Called forth? Bound to something long forgotten? Hawthorne had never housed anyone like her before, and it never would again. By the end of February 1850, the cold winds howled louder through Westvale, and the silence within Hawthorne Asylum grew heavier with each passing night. The girl remained in Room 9, always seated at the edge of her cot, always silent, always watching. There was something in her gaze, not violent, not sad, but unsettlingly knowing. Those who dared to meet her eyes often looked away within seconds. Some claimed it felt like she was inside their heads. Others insisted she saw something behind them that they couldn't see. One night, Nurse Collins found something strange. While sorting through the patient record books in the administration wing, she noticed a page missing. It wasn't torn or folded, it was simply ... gone. The binding was undisturbed, the numbering skipped without evidence of removal. More concerning, the missing page had belonged to the girl. Puzzled and somewhat shaken, Collins returned to Room 9 to check the paper. Logs she kept under her supervision. That, too, had changed. Where once she had written notes about the girl's eating habits, sleeping posture, and slate scribbles, there now stood blank lines, like the ink had faded from within, rather than over time. When she tried to rewrite the entries from memory, the pen would stop working every time her hand hovered near the word girl. That same week, Dr. Avery, the asylum's only remaining night physician, began waking up with strange symbols drawn on the inside of his coat. He assumed it was a prank from the interns, until he locked his coat in his drawer one night and returned the next morning to find a faint, white chalk imprint of what looked like ancient sigils across the lining. When he attempted to trace the pattern, he felt a sudden jolt of nausea and dropped the chalk. It shattered into dust without hitting the floor. The following morning, 3 names on the hospital's official staffing list vanished, not crossed out, not erased, just ... gone. Margaret Collins, Dr. Avery, and Father Bennick, the priest who had once blessed Room 9, were still present and working at the asylum, but their names were absent from all documentation, even pay stubs and church records. Strangely, no one else in the town remembered Father Bennick ever serving at Hawthorne, not even his own parish. Panicked, Collins approached Dr. Carter, demanding to know what he made of it all. But Carter had changed since. The girl arrived. Once assertive and intellectually curious, he now spoke in riddles and often trailed off mid-sentence. He seemed worn down, as if fighting something invisible. When she questioned him directly about the missing names, he muttered, "They're not missing. We are." That night, Nurse Collins found a torn page stuffed behind one of the chapel pews. It was a piece of her own journal, the one she had kept private in her quarters. The page was folded, damp, and scrawled with handwriting, not her own, but written in her exact style. At the bottom, a single word had been etched repeatedly: return. It looked like it had been scratched with fingernails. As paranoia deepened, so did the sense that something within Room 9 was not just observing, but actively unmaking the world around it, starting with memory, then records, then identity. Objects moved, words changed. People who had interacted with the girl grew forgetful or distant. A groundskeeper named Ellis was found sitting beneath the asylum's great oak tree one morning, barefoot and mumbling. She took the day from me. She took the whole day. Security was tightened, though few dared patrol the girl's hallway. A nurse posted outside Room 9 fainted one night, later reporting she had heard her mother's voice calling to her from within the walls. Another claimed that, during the midnight shift, the corridor stretched longer than it should have, doorways moving subtly, the angles of corners becoming ... wrong. Renovation workers, called in to repaint the east wing, reported something even more unsettling. While scraping paint from the wall across from Room 9, they uncovered an older layer with words scrawled beneath. This room should not be. The handwriting again matched Collins, despite her never having been in that hallway with a brush. Doctor Avery, increasingly disturbed by the recurrence of his own handwriting in places he had never written, ordered a controlled test. He left a slate and chalk in Room 9 overnight, carefully sealed inside a locked case. The next morning, the box was undisturbed, still sealed, but the chalk was gone. In its place was a detailed, anatomically correct drawing of Avery's heart, complete with a note beneath: "Too much burden. You should rest." That same day, Avery collapsed from an undiagnosed cardiac condition. He never returned to work. Following this, more staff requested transfers or abandoned their posts altogether. One intern, Jonathan Bell, broke down in front of the hospital board and began sobbing uncontrollably. "She erased my brother," he wept. "He was real. We shared a room. He's not in my family records anymore. My parents don't even remember him." Dr. Carter, who had once denied ever knowing the girl, grew gaunt and silent. He began avoiding the staff entirely, retreating to the basement archives. Occasionally, he'd emerge with his hands covered in ink or soot, muttering about tracing back the beginning. When asked directly, he'd only say, "This didn't start here." But here is where it ends. Room 9 remained untouched. The girl didn't age. She didn't sleep. But her presence continued to undo the very fabric of the asylum's reality, starting with names, the markers of memory and identity. She was not simply part of the building anymore. She had become something else, woven into the corridors, stitched into the ledgers, living quietly in the forgotten spaces between existence and absence. And still, every morning, soot gathered beneath her door. By the summer of 1851, the sun over Arkansas burned hotter than usual, turning the earth to baked clay and casting long warped shadows across the stone facade of Hawthorne Asylum. The air hung thick with an uneasy stillness, like a held breath no one dared release. Inside the asylum, Silence was no longer a balm. It had become a presence in itself, heavy and intrusive, especially around the girl who never spoke. Though she never uttered a word, her presence spoke volumes. Nurses stepped lightly around her, avoiding her gaze, while the orderlies passed each other, knowing glances when assigned to her wing. Something unspoken clung to her like a second skin, something old, older than the stones that formed the asylum's spine. Even the building seemed to react to her now. Walls groaned when she passed, doors creaked open on their own, and drafts followed her like ghosts on leashes. By now, she had been moved to the upper floor room 24 far from the rest of the patients. The relocation was labeled as a safety measure, but it was clear to anyone with eyes that it was exile. No doctor claimed responsibility for the decision. It simply happened as if willed by the building itself. The room was small, almost barren, save for a single bed, a wash basin, and a wooden chair. A narrow window let in little light, its view obstructed by the overgrown hedges outside. But the walls told their own story. Faint scratches marred the stone surface behind her bed, some curved like glyphs, others straight and angry like claw marks. More concerning were the shapes that had begun to appear on the surface in places no one could reach. Symbols, never painted nor etched by human hands, seemed to bloom from the rock itself. At first, the staff dismissed these marks as cracks or stains, figments of their imagination, nothing more. But they grew clearer with time, and a pattern began to emerge. Concentric circles, forked lines, and an unfamiliar script that curled like vines. Reverend Josiah Merton was the first to call them angelic runes, though he did not seem at ease using that term. Dr. Hayworth, however, took a different approach. Fascinated yet uneasy, he started cataloging the markings every week, sketching them in his private ledger. He never told the other physicians what he feared, that the girl herself was somehow willing these forms into existence without ever touching the wall. One morning, a new symbol appeared, 2 inverted triangles, one nested within the other, surrounded by dots. It hadn't been there the night before, and no one had entered the room during the night. The nurses were adamant. Yet there it was, stark and recent. The girl sat under it, knees tucked to her chest, eyes wide and blank as ever. Dr. Hayworth noted a strange shift in the air pressure that morning, as though the entire wing had sunk several feet into the earth. He described it later in his journal as the sensation of being submerged while fully awake. What made matters worse was the change in the behavior of the asylum's older patients. Those who had once sat calmly in the sunroom now screamed, without cause. One by one, they began referring to the whispering girl in the stone tower, though they could never have known where she'd been relocated. The whispers weren't confined to the patients. Late at night, nurses heard murmurs coming through the ventilation grates, voices layered over each other like threads in a twisted hymn. When they went to investigate, they found only the girl sitting quietly, unblinking, facing the wall. Her presence began to affect the staff in subtle but undeniable ways. Miss Weaver, a strict and rational woman of 30 years, began to suffer from sleep paralysis and refused to enter room 24. Her hair grayed over the course of 3 weeks, and she resigned quietly, leaving without saying goodbye. 2 weeks later, she was found walking along the river's edge, speaking a language no one recognized. The effects weren't confined to the staff. The building itself began to age strangely. Paint peeled from rooms recently redone, wood warped, without moisture, and windows frosted over, even in the height of summer. The south wing's clock tower stopped, always fixed at 3:19 a.m., the precise time Reverend Merton claimed to have heard someone reciting scripture in reverse. Meanwhile, the girl remained unchanged. She neither grew taller nor thinner, neither aged nor decayed. Her skin was flawless, unmarked by time or illness. Her black eyes never wavered in their emptiness, and her silence deepened into something more profound, an absence of presence, a vacancy that devoured meaning. The wall in her room became a mosaic of indecipherable forms, what some began to call the prayer stone. Rumors swirled among the staff that those who stared at it too long experienced waking dreams, glimpses of their dead loved ones, or suffered seizures marked by a strange rigidity of the limbs. One orderly, Peter Maddox, collapsed in front of the wall and remained unconscious for 2 full days. Upon waking, he refused to speak of what he saw, but he never returned to the asylum again, taking work as a fisherman miles away from town. Reverend Merton, too, began to slip. Once a firm believer in divine order, he now walked the hallways muttering phrases that sounded scriptural, but didn't exist in any Bible known to man. He took to drawing strange circles in the margins of his hymnal, and on the morning of June 3rd, he was found in the chapel, hands bloodied from scratching at the stone floor beneath the altar. He was taken away quietly, his eyes wide and terrified, repeating one phrase over and over: "The wall remembers. The wall remembers." Dr. Hayworth, driven by a need to understand, locked himself in the girl's room one night, armed only with a notebook and a lantern. He sat in the wooden chair and stared at the wall, refusing to leave until he understood what it meant. 4 hours, nothing happened. Then, just before dawn, he began to write furiously, his pen scratching like claws across the page. What he wrote would never be shared. When they found him the next morning, he was alive but changed. His left hand trembled uncontrollably, and his eyes no longer recognized his colleagues. He simply handed them the notebook and asked to be left alone. The notebook's final page read, "She is not here to be healed. She is the memory of something forgotten, the echo of a time before time. We built this place on land that remembers what we tried to bury." The walls, it seemed, were not merely stone. They were keepers of memory, and the girl silent and still was their voice. By the winter of 1852, something strange had settled over Hawthorne Asylum. Not a darkness exactly, but a feverish tension, like an invisible wire pulled taut and humming just below the threshold of sound. The institution, once echoing with the creaks of rocking chairs and the hollow prayers of its more devout residents, now exhaled a kind of mute suspense. No one knew what they were waiting for, but they waited all the same. It was the girl who drew them inward. Even without speaking, she had become the center of an unwelcome gravity, the sort of pull that yanked at reason and scraped against the limits of one's inner faith. And it wasn't just the staff anymore. The patients once resigned to their silent routines now whispered of her with wide eyes and trembling hands, as if she'd become both savior and curse. In the stillness of chapel mornings, or beneath the cracked arches of the dormitory hallways, her name passed from one cracked mind to another like a prayer that burned the tongue. Her presence grew more acute. Not louder, no. She still uttered not a sound, but deeper. She began to move without being seen, to stand where no one remembered placing her, and to appear in the corners of dreams that had once belonged to the mad alone. A nurse once turned around while scrubbing the hallway floors and found her standing an inch from her shoulder, barefoot, eyes fixed on the stone beneath her. She hadn't made a sound, no breath, no footfall, just ... Arrival. But it wasn't her silence that haunted the staff now. It was the reaction of the patients. The most violent, the most delusional, the most broken, they had begun to gather around her like animals around a waterhole. No hostility, no frenzy. Just ... calm. They sat cross-legged in circles where she walked, their heads bowed, sometimes murmuring words that weren't words at all. A man named Paulson, who hadn't eaten in weeks, took her hand once and wept, uncontrollably, until he collapsed. A girl known for pulling out her hair, strand by strand began braiding it instead, eyes blank, staring always in the girl's direction. Even the walls seemed to respond. Mold traced unusual shapes along the baseboards, like blooming ferns in a time-lapse decay. Watermarks on the ceilings no longer resembled the usual damp ghosts. They took on sharper outlines, almost resembling faces, expressions frozen in mid-scream or prayer. And the chapel? The chapel became something else entirely. It was in the chapel that the fever took hold in earnest. Sister Beatrice was the first to fall. A devout woman, deeply bound to her faith and unimpressed by anything not stamped with the seal of divine authority, she had resisted the growing awe around the girl. She had called it idolatry, madness, a test. But during an afternoon service, she collapsed mid-recitation, her eyes rolling back, her mouth contorting into a snarl of gibberish that no one recognized. They carried her to her bed, her limbs twitching as if shocked by some unseen current. And when she finally awoke hours later, she simply stared at nothing. Or perhaps at something no one else could see. Then came the others. 3 orderlies succumbed to hallucinations so intense they were restrained and locked in the very cells they once guarded. Patients once docile became frenzied. Others, once violent, grew peaceful in disturbing ways, smiling as they rocked, humming tuneless songs with blood on their fingernails. It was as if the girl had pulled every mind around her into an alternate rhythm, a tempo of her own silent choosing, and she was always calm, even as the asylum unraveled its structure of sanity, bending and groaning under the weight of unseen forces. The girl walked with bare feet across cold stone, unbothered by the screams, the babble, the prayers. Her dress, though tattered, never dirtied. Her eyes remained blank, unseeing, and yet somehow all-seeing. Dr. Harding began documenting everything in a journal he locked away each night beneath his floorboards. He no longer trusted the night, orderlies not. After one of them attempted to drag the girl to the well out back, shouting about cleansing her of the sickness. The man had been found with both wrists fractured and his jaw dislocated, as if he'd been gripped by something far stronger than her frail frame. The girl had not moved. She had simply watched. The journal entries grew frantic. Her presence is now chemical, he wrote one evening. She saturates the air like salt in water, no longer distinct, but entirely infused. The boundaries between self and her seem to blur in those who spend too long near her. He tried to measure the effects, to observe from a distance. But it was like trying to observe gravity. She did not do. She simply was, and in being, she bent all things around her. And perhaps most unsettling of all, she had not aged. Not 1 inch. Not one day. Other girls in the asylum had matured into adolescents' awkward limbs, acne, uncertain posture. But she remained unchanged, not stunted, not sickly, just frozen, as though the hourglass had been turned on its side the day she arrived. Outside, the hills of Arkansas iced over. Winter came hard that year. Visitors grew scarce. Letters went unanswered. The asylum became a sealed box with something ancient stirring at its center. And still she walked, always alone, always watching, but something was building now. Something, thickening in the air, denser than dread, more electrified than mere superstition. Not even the most rational among them could dismiss it anymore. The fever wasn't just madness. It was transformation. One by one, everyone in Hawthorne Asylum was being reshaped, broken down, rewired, remade. By her silence, by her stillness, by the things she carried within. And though no one said it out loud, not even in whispered prayer, the fear was growing clear in every heart. Whatever had arrived in that girl's body 3 years ago was no longer dormant. By the time autumn laid its amber hands on the Hawthorne Asylum grounds, The air grew heavy with a silence too deliberate, as though the very trees were holding their breath. A girl still unnamed and unreadable remained the eye of the storm, a still and quiet presence around whom time seemed to curl like smoke. Her behaviors had shifted yet again, subtly but unmistakably. She had begun to gravitate toward the cemetery. The asylum's burial grounds were tucked behind the chapel, hidden by twisted oaks that clawed toward the sky like ancient penitents. It was where those who had succumbed to madness or neglect were, quietly laid to rest, sometimes without ceremony, often without a name. But now something had stirred among the stones and soil, and the girl, with her blank expression and slow, deliberate steps, seemed to be drawn to it. Each evening, just before twilight, she would slip from the halls unnoticed until one nurse, Martha Halcombe, followed her. What Martha witnessed was not a child wandering aimlessly. The girl stopped at specific graves as though summoned. She stood motionless before them, her head tilted to the side, the wind playing with her hair. Sometimes her hand would reach out not to touch the gravestones, but to hover just above the earth, like a pendulum seeking resonance. The graves she visited, records later revealed, belonged to patients who had died under mysterious circumstances, those who had spoken of voices in the walls, of children crying from behind bricks, of the smell of ash and burning hair in rooms where no fire had ever touched. They had all died within the past 10 years, and each had been buried quickly, quietly, without family. Martha reported this to Dr. Halridge, expecting skepticism, but instead received a grave nod. He had been poring over patient logs himself, and had come across odd consistencies, repeated phrases written in different hands, different decades. She is near, the one without sound. She knows what we forget. And now the girls stood at their graves. That week, a storm struck. The region, flooding roads and toppling trees. The asylum, sturdy but old, suffered a partial power loss, and some of the lower-level records rooms became inaccessible. The cemetery, however, took the brunt of nature's rage. Several graves collapsed in on themselves, their contents disturbed by uprooted trees and loosened soil. Among the collapse, 3 coffins broke open. Inside, what remained of the bodies was unnatural. Martha, along with 2 groundskeepers, discovered them during a routine damage assessment. One corpse had been twisted entirely backward, spine corkscrewed as if turned by a cruel hand. Another had hands that had not decayed, but blackened as if burned. The third had teeth, not human teeth, but long, spiked, misshapen things like a wolf's jaw forced into a man's skull. None of this was recorded in the death logs. The groundskeepers fled the job entirely, and Martha fainted on the spot. When word reached Dr. Halridge, he quietly ordered the graves resealed. No clergy was called, no authorities notified. He insisted. This was the cost of madness left unchecked, of old, untreated suffering. But privately, in his study, he scribbled more urgently in his hidden notebook. He began comparing burial records with the girl's behavior. To his astonishment, every time she stood near a grave, the next day that plot would shift slightly, the soil freshly disturbed, the flowers dead overnight, or sometimes the scent of sulfur hanging in the air. It was as though her very presence animated what should not stir. Dr. Halridge also noted something else. Staff were beginning to have dreams. Not nightmares, exactly, but vivid, visceral images. The same reoccurring visions. A black well in the forest, a faceless woman with braided hair standing beside it, and the sound of a lullaby sung backward. In these dreams, the girl always stood nearby, her face pale as moonlight, one eye blackened as if bruised, the other weeping blood. Some began sleepwalking. One orderly woke to find himself outside, barefoot, standing at the edge of the cemetery, unaware of how he'd gotten there. Another nurse, had claw marks down her arms, self-inflicted in a sleep-induced panic. She claimed, though she didn't remember why she'd been afraid. One night, Martha gathered the courage to confront the girl. She waited until the girl crept to the cemetery again, then followed at a distance. The moon was high, bright enough to paint the stones in silver. The girl walked calmly, feet silent against the damp earth, and stopped at the oldest grave in the lot, one with no name, no date, only a stone scarred by time. Martha watched as the girl crouched, and then, to her horror, she leaned in and placed her ear to the ground. It was not a child's game. Her body went stiff as though struck by lightning. Her back arched slightly, and her fingers dug into the soil. A soft sound escaped her mouth, not speech, not even a gasp, but something like a broken music box winding down. Martha ran. She didn't stop until she reached the chapel, and when she turned to look behind her, the girl was still there, still. Listening. From that day forward, Martha began seeing things. Reflections in windows that didn't belong to her. A child's footprint in her locked room. Once she opened her wardrobe to find it filled with dead leaves. She left Hawthorne within the week. The cemetery was fenced off after that. No one was allowed to approach it, and yet the girl continued her nocturnal visits. No door could stop her. No lock stayed latched. She was never seen walking through walls, but she always ended up on the other side, as though the asylum itself bent around her path. Dr. Helridge, sleepless and increasingly paranoid, recorded in his journal, "The girl hears what the dead still whisper. She does not summon them. They come to her. They know her. They remember her. Perhaps they always have. I fear we are not observing her. We are part of her remembering." By the end of autumn, 8 staff members had resigned. The asylum grew, quieter, but the girl remained, watching, listening, walking the land like she had lived there long before any of them had arrived. And under the dirt, something stirred when she passed, something that did not stay buried. By the early months of 1853, Hawthorne Asylum was no longer a place of sterile order and medical curiosity. It had become a monument to quiet dread. The once proud red brick walls had turned to a sickly shade, as if absorbing the despair that lingered within. Most staff had either resigned or mysteriously vanished, and those who remained worked in hushed tones, eyes constantly flitting to shadows that seemed too thick for daylight. And always, at the center of it all, was the girl, still mute, still untouched by time. Dr. Hiram Wexley had inherited the girl's case after Dr. Everly's untimely disappearance. Everly had simply walked into the observation room one night and was never seen again. No screams, no signs of a struggle, just an open door, a flickering oil lamp, and his coat still hanging on the back of the chair. Wexley was not a man of spiritual leanings. He had long abandoned belief in the divine after witnessing a child die from a botched amputation in his early years of practice. To him, the world was only what could be measured, dissected, and understood. Yet even he found himself avoiding the girl's room after sundown, assigning nurses to check her vitals and report back in writing. But eventually, the curiosity won. One evening, Wexley made the decision to conduct a full examination, one last attempt to catalog whatever anomaly this creature presented. She had not aged, not changed, not even blinked out of rhythm in nearly 4 years. Her presence had become a fixed point in the asylum, an unshifting silence that bent the world around it. He began by reviewing the accumulated records. There were hundreds of pages, each bearing identical notes. Heart rate steady, breath shallow, but rhythmic, body temperature low but constant. No evidence of malnutrition despite minimal consumption. And above all, the same scrawled comment on every form since 1849. Eyes remain open, constant, watching. That evening, Wexley entered the room alone. The girl lay on the cot, her face turned to the ceiling, expression unreadable. Her skin remained unnaturally pale, almost waxen, as if her body had begun rejecting life years ago, but hadn't quite succeeded. Her lips did not move, her chest barely lifted. Yet her eyes, those eyes remained painfully alert. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Speaking around her had long proven useless. Instead, he slowly approached and laid out his tools on the side table: stethoscope, thermometer, reflex hammer. Normal instruments for a patient far from normal. He checked her pulse steady, tapped her knee, no reaction. Moved her arm limp, but compliant. All seemed consistent with prior evaluations. Then he did something no one had dared attempt before. He shined a lantern directly into her eyes. What followed was not a blink. It was not a flinch. It was something else, something utterly wrong. Her pupils dilated and then narrowed to pinpoints in a sequence far too rapid for any natural reflex. It was as though her eyes were reading the light, translating it, as if she understood it on a level no human should. And then, for the first time, Wexley heard something from her mouth, a soft clicking noise. Not a word, not a breath. A mechanical, a rhythmic tick like a broken metronome. It came in bursts. 10 seconds of silence. Then click, pause, click, click, silence. He staggered back, his knees nearly buckling under the weight of sudden nausea. The room tilted, or perhaps it was his mind. He clutched the chair for balance and tried to speak, to call for help, but the words caught in his throat like thorns. And then she turned her head, just slightly. Just enough. The motion was slow, deliberate, and completely void of muscle strain. Her neck didn't tense. Her eyes didn't drift. It was as though the entire world had shifted, and she remained still while everything else rotated around her. She was looking at him now, not through him. At him, and what he saw in her gaze was not malice. It was not innocence. It was an absence, a void where personhood should have existed. A great and terrible vacancy filled only by incomprehensible awareness. In that moment, Wexley understood. Why Everly had disappeared. He had stared too long. He had tried to comprehend something the mind was never meant to touch. The girl was not human in any way that mattered. Her body may have mimicked flesh, but her presence was something older far. Older. He stumbled out of the room and collapsed in the hallway. Nurses found him shaking, unable to speak, eyes wide and wet with tears. He spent the next 3 days in the infirmary, refusing to eat or sleep. When he finally spoke again, all he said was, "She blinked." That word blinked spread through the asylum like wildfire. It was the first and only change in her behavior in 4 years. And with that one tiny act, a fragile illusion was shattered. Suddenly, the theory that she was merely catatonic seemed laughable. Patients began convulsing in the night, murmuring in dead languages. Doors opened on their own. Mirrors cracked without impact. Birds no longer roosted on the windowsills, and rats avoided the basement. The staff, dwindling by the week, began calling her the Anchor. A name born not out of reverence, but out of fear that she was tethering something to this world, some force vast and unknowable. One day, Nurse Calhoun brought a tray of food and found the door ajar. She paused, heart pounding. Stepping inside, she saw the cot emptied out. The girl was gone. No footprints, no sign of struggle, no open window. Just her gown folded neatly on the bed and a deep indentation in the mattress, as if she had never weighed anything at all. What remained, however, was far worse. The walls were covered in symbols scratched, not drawn, markings that looked burned into the stone by pure intent. They spiraled outward from the bed, looping like veins across the ceiling and floor. Words no one recognized, letters not part of any language. and at the very center of it all, where her head had once rested, lay a single white feather. It pulsed faintly, as if alive. Wexley left that night and never returned. He moved north, changed his name, and lived in isolation until his death in 1881. In his journal sealed until after his passing, he wrote one final entry regarding the girl. She was not lost. She was not found. She was placed here to be seen. And we saw her. But what the world had seen, it could never unsee. And Hawthorne Asylum? It stood for 5 more years before mysteriously burning to the ground, its stone foundation, cracking open as though rejecting whatever had once lain within. But that wasn't the end. Not by far. Because while the girl had vanished, stories of a silent figure appearing in villages and forests hundreds of miles away began surfacing in whispers. She was still watching, and something was watching back. The coldness in the air wasn't just seasonal anymore. It had taken on a personality, moody, intelligent, watching. Every breath drawn inside the Hawthorne Asylum felt weighed down by the gaze of something ancient, something submerged in time and purpose. The staff had grown pale and distant, their gaze segmented into 2 expressions. What happened before the chapel quake, and what came after. The structural crack beneath the chapel floor had widened. It wasn't natural. No quake had been reported in the region. Yet something beneath had shifted. Sister Odelia had sworn she heard voices rising from the split stone whispers, layered in forgotten tongues, like the echo of prayers offered to a God that no longer listened. The board wanted to fill it with mortar. Dr. Aldous requested otherwise. The girl's behavior had become intricately timed with the crack's expansion. Each day it grew wider. Her silence grew more oppressive. She had stopped moving entirely. Not in resistance, but in focus. She simply stood for hours in her room, eyes fixed on the southeastern wall, where the shadow of the chapel fell at dusk. It was Father Mercier who proposed that the opening be explored, though he no longer wore his collar with comfort. If we are to cure the girl, he had said, eyes hollow, we must understand what she is reflecting. Beneath the chapel, a trapdoor hidden beneath planks was discovered during repair efforts. Oddly, the girl smiled when it was found. Just once, a flicker so brief that only the observant nurse Delphine caught it. She later confided that the expression had chilled her more than any scream. Dr. Aldous, Father Mercier, and 2 groundsmen descended the passage. The air that greeted them was no air at all, thick, damp, scented with roots and old things better, left unremembered. The corridor descended into the earth like a throat swallowing. Their lanterns cast long shadows along the walls, etched with drawings, not recent, not childish, but precise in their grotesqueness. They portrayed human forms kneeling before an immense feminine figure, faceless and haloed with serpents. Behind her stood tall spires, crowned with skeletal bells. This wasn't Christian imagery. It wasn't even pagan. It was something else. It's the girl, Mercier whispered, voice cracking. It's her. She's been worshipped before. The path led to a chamber, rectangular, stone-floored, and unsealed for what seemed like centuries. In its center lay a slab, more altar than table, stained and chipped. On each corner rested objects resembling urns, only these bore no inscriptions, no lids. Just hollow vessels, bone-dry and humming faintly. But it was the wall behind the slab that silenced them all. There, carved deeply into the stone, was the girl's face. Not a likeness, not a resemblance. Her exact face down to the crescent scar. Above the brow, down to the downward tilt of her eyes. Time-worn, but unmistakable. The rendering had to be at least 200 years old. Older, perhaps. Older than the asylum. Older than Arkansas itself. The men stood transfixed, unable to speak. One of the groundsmen began to sob. Father Mercier turned to leave, muttering prayers that sounded like warnings. But Dr. Aldous stepped forward. He knelt before the altar, as if compelled not by belief, but by resignation. As if the puzzle had been solved, and the only answer was surrender. When they emerged hours later, the storm had rolled in. Thunder cracked over the hills, and the trees bent like witnesses, averting their eyes. The girl had not moved, but when Dr. Aldous entered her room that night, he fell to one knee. Not out of weakness, out of reverence. She turned to him slowly, her eyes not blank as they had once been, but full of knowledge, of grief, and of command. She nodded once, and he left without a word. The following week, strange occurrences began to plague the asylum. Birds flew into windows in the dozens. Clocks malfunctioned, either freezing at 3:14 a.m. or spinning uncontrollably. The chapel bell, long rusted, began ringing at night. No one pulled its rope dot in a letter addressed to a theological historian in Boston. Father Mercier confessed what he had seen, though he never posted it. The letter was found later, after he vanished. It read, in part, "There is something beneath Hawthorne, something seeded in the soil long before Scripture reached these hills. She is not cursed. She is not possessed. She is a remnant preserved. Echo of something not meant for our time. I fear she is remembering what we have forgotten." The asylum continued operating in fragments. Staff quit or disappeared. The few who remained seemed subdued, wandering the halls with downward eyes. The girl, now referred to in whispers as the mirror, was moved to a sealed wing, where only Dr. Aldous had access dot by candlelight. He studied the carvings from below, drawing copies by hand and cross-referencing them with texts that didn't belong in any sane medical library. He barely slept. His hair whitened. He spoke less. But his journals told a different story, a mind unraveling with reverence dot in one entry. He wrote, "She is not here to be understood. She is here to be obeyed." The girl had begun painting on her walls, not with paint, but with ash. Symmetrical spirals, inverted trees, human silhouettes with hollow chests and mouths sewn shut. One of the nurses mistook it for madness. Until the night she saw those same shapes appear in frost patterns on the infirmary windows. And again, weeks later, etched in ice over the lake's surface. What frightened the staff most wasn't her silence anymore. It was the possibility that she wasn't waiting. She was remembering. And with each recovered memory, something unseen was waking with her. Father Mercier's room was sealed the day after his disappearance. Inside, his cross had been broken into 2 clean pieces, and his mirror covered in black cloth. What remained of the corridor beneath the chapel was bricked off by order of the state, but the girl continued to stand at her window at dusk, staring toward the shadowed chapel wall. Some claimed they saw her lips move, though no sound emerged. Others claimed her shadow moved out of rhythm with her body. In truth, the asylum was no longer a place of healing. It had become a place of preservation for something buried, something ancient, something that had taken the shape of a child to return unnoticed. And it was no longer waiting. It was preparing. When the asylum was finally shuttered in the fall of 1865, the war had ended, but the land still felt haunted. The South was bruised and splintered, and the ghosts of what had happened at Hawthorne clung to the crumbling walls like mildew on stone. No ceremony marked the closure, no final procession of staff or patients. They simply stopped coming. The gates rusted, the garden overgrew with thornbush and kudzu, and the wind whispered secrets through the cracked shutters of the upper rooms. It would be another 3 decades before anyone dared to officially revisit the grounds. In 1897, the Arkansas State Historical Society sent a team to catalog the remains of Hawthorne Asylum, ostensibly for archival preservation. Though it was whispered, they were more interested in the folklore. By that time, the place was a ruin. Vines crawled across the stone walls like veins across ancient skin, and the wrought iron fence stood bent and jagged, like it had tried to escape what it once enclosed. They entered the main hall first, where the floors sagged and dust clung. In the air thick as fog, their lanterns illuminated torn furniture and collapsed beams. But more curiously, they found the third-floor corridor nearly untouched by rot unnaturally preserved, as though time itself had forgotten that wing. In one room at the end of the hall, the air grew cold enough to see breath. The team noted how their candles dimmed without flickering, how even the insects avoided the space. It was the former nursery ward. There, in a small cubby behind the plaster, beneath a warped floorboard, they found something that would become the subject of great debate. A locked wooden box, unmarked except for a symbol carved into its tapa. Circle intersected by 5 arrows. No key accompanied it, and though one man swore he saw it glow faintly when touched, the others laughed it off as nerves. Eventually, the box was transported to the Historical Society's vault in Little Rock, where it sat unopened for weeks. It wasn't until one assistant archivist, Eleanor Blackwood, only 22 years old at the time, disregarded protocol and pried it open with a chisel, that its contents were revealed. Inside, wrapped in age-stiffened cloth, were dozens of handwritten pages bound loosely with twine. The ink had faded, but remained legible. The writings bore the signature of matron Elsbeth Crane. The contents, however, were not simple notes or records. They were testimonies, fevered accounts of visions, of unnatural occurrences, of dreams that bled into waking life. Elsbeth wrote of the girl, always unnamed, describing her not as a patient, but as a presence. She chronicled how time bent around her, how gravity seemed to loosen in her presence, how she aged neither forward nor backward, but in place. She recounted the night she had tried to euthanize the girl in a moment of terror, and how the girl merely stared, calm, while the syringe shattered in Elsbeth's hands. "She is not of us," the matron had written. "She is not of here, and I am afraid she is the beginning of something none of us understand." Further into the pages, Elsbeth confessed to her growing belief that the girl had no past, only futures. "I dream of cities that do not yet exist, metal towers that reach clouds, ships that fly without sails, voices that travel through wire and air. I dream them when I sleep beside her room." And then, more ominously, she wrote, "I see fire falling from the sky. I see oceans swallowing the land. I see the girl standing unharmed in the ash, her eyes older than the stars. She does not weep. She only watches." Eleanor Blackwood brought the writings to the Society's director. The reaction was swift and cold. The documents were sealed, labeled psychotic episode, and locked away. Eleanor was quietly dismissed. But she had already made copies. In the years that followed, rumors of the girl grew into legend. Locals referred to her as the Whisper of Hawthorne. Children dared each other to sleep near the gates. A photographer in 1902 claimed he captured her in the background of a long exposure shot of the ruins. The photo showed a blurred figure, translucent and pale, peering through a broken window on the 3rd floor. Experts dismissed it as a trick of light, but it was enough to ignite obsession. Occult circles began to take interest. One medium from New Orleans claimed she made contact with a being that wore the face of a child, but spoke in memories not yet made. A Harvard professor in 1910 wrote a confidential paper arguing that the Hawthorne girl might be a temporal anomaly, citing Elsbeth's journal as the most disturbing evidence of nonlinear consciousness I've ever encountered. The paper was never published. By 1945, with the world reeling from war and the horrors of atomic fire, a government agency believed to be a predecessor of today's DARPA visited the site. Records suggest they removed a number of items from The vaults, including the original box and journal. All reference to the girl vanished from public record after that dot, but stories have a way of surviving where facts fail. In 1973, an elderly man named Jonah Klein claimed in an audio recording that he had worked at the asylum as a boy during the final months before its closure. He swore that in his final week there, he watched a girl walk through the east wall of the building without opening the door, leaving no mark behind. She turned her head just once, he said, voice shaking. Her eyes were silver, like the moon through fog. And I swear to God, I felt my heart stop for a beat too long. He died 3 days after the recording was made. Heart failure, they said. Today, the land where Hawthorne once stood is government property, fenced and monitored, officially labeled as a wildlife research zone. No construction is allowed, no photographs permitted. Locals still claim that. Lights move through the trees at night, and that sometimes just before dawn, you can hear the faint sound of a lullaby. Not sung, but hummed, like a forgotten melody that belongs to no one, yet echoes through time. Of the girl, there are no modern photos, no confirmed sightings, no birth records, no grave dot, but deep in some locked archive, buried beneath layers of suppression and bureaucracy, lies a box. And within it, the final page of Elsbeth Crane's journal, written in trembling script. She was never meant to be found. She was meant to be remembered.